Picture this, it's May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. American and Soviet soldiers are embracing each other on the Elbe River, celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany. They're laughing, sharing cigarettes, toasting with vodka. These two nations just saved the world together. Yet within months, they'd become the most dangerous enemies in human history. What happened? How did the greatest alliance of the 20th century transform into a rivalry that brought us to the brink of nuclear annihilation? The answer lies in a story that's never been fully told. A story of betrayal, misunderstanding, and two superpowers whose friendship was doomed from the very moment it began. You see, most people think the Cold War started because of ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus authoritarianism. But that's not the whole truth. The real story is far more complex, more personal, and more tragic than you've ever imagined. Let me take you back to that moment when everything changed. When two former allies looked at each other across the ruins of Europe and realized they'd just created their greatest threat. The year is 1941. Nazi Germany has just launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 4 million Axis troops are pouring into the Soviet Union. Stalin's Red Army is collapsing. Moscow seems doomed. This is the moment when an unlikely partnership was born. Not out of friendship, but out of desperation. Franklin Roosevelt made a decision that would reshape the world. Despite fierce opposition from his own advisors, despite the fact that Stalin had signed a pact with Hitler just 2 years earlier, Roosevelt chose to support the Soviet Union. If Hitler invaded hell, Winston Churchill famously said, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. But here's what they don't teach you in history books. This alliance was built on a foundation of lies. Both sides were planning for the post-war world while pretending to trust each other. American intelligence was already spying on their Soviet allies. Stalin was already planning to dominate Eastern Europe. The seeds of the Cold War were planted in the very moment these two nations shook hands. The human cost of this deception is staggering. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II. 27 million, to put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Texas. Every Soviet family lost someone. Every village had mass graves. The psychological trauma ran so deep it changed the Russian soul forever. Meanwhile, America emerged from the war virtually untouched. 0 battles on American soil. Cities intact. Economy booming. For the first time in history, one nation possessed weapons that could destroy civilization itself. The atomic bomb. Imagine how that looked to a Soviet leader who had just watched his country bleed for 4 years. This is where the story gets really interesting. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Harry Truman met Stalin for the first time. Truman, the former haberdasher from Missouri, found himself face to face with the man who controlled half of Europe. What happened in those private meetings changed everything. Truman tried to intimidate Stalin by casually mentioning America's new weapon of unusual destructive force. He expected fear. Instead, Stalin showed no reaction at all. Why? Because Soviet spies had already told him about the Manhattan Project. The atomic secrets weren't secret at all. Both leaders were playing a game where everyone was cheating and everyone knew it. But the real turning point came in the months after the war ended. American soldiers wanted to go home. They had families, jobs, dreams of a peaceful future. Within a year, U.S. forces in Europe dropped from 3 million to 200,000. Stalin, however, kept his armies in place. Soviet troops occupied Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. To American eyes, this looked like aggression, but to Soviet eyes, it looked like survival. Russia had been invaded through Eastern Europe countless times. By Napoleon, by the Kaiser, by Hitler. Stalin wasn't planning conquest. He was planning never to be invaded again. Two nations looked at the same facts and saw completely different threats. The moment that sealed their fate came on February 22, 1946. George Kennan, American diplomat in Moscow, sent a secret telegram to Washington. 8,000 words that would define American foreign policy for the next 5 decades. The long telegram, as it became known, painted the Soviet Union as an expansionist threat that could only be contained, never befriended. Kennan wrote that Soviet leaders were driven by a neurotic view of world affairs, and saw conflict with capitalism as inevitable. He was right about Soviet paranoia, but he missed something crucial. American actions were making that paranoia worse. Every U.S. military base in Europe, every alliance with former German allies, every atomic bomb test confirmed Soviet fears that America was preparing for war. The tragedy is that both sides were reacting to threats that the other side never intended to create. America built NATO to defend against Soviet expansion. The Soviets created the Warsaw Pact to defend against NATO encirclement. Each defensive move looked like an offensive threat to the other side. It was like two people backing away from each other in fear, each convinced the other was advancing with hostile intent. By 1947, the die was cast. The Truman Doctrine committed America to containing communist expansion worldwide. The Marshall Plan offered economic aid to rebuild Europe, but only if countries rejected Soviet influence. Stalin saw this as economic warfare and forbade Eastern European nations from participating. Europe was divided by what Churchill called an Iron Curtain. But here's the part that will shock you. It didn't have to happen this way. In 1945, both nations wanted peace. American opinion polls showed that most Americans viewed the Soviet Union as a potential partner, not an enemy. Stalin, despite his paranoia, believed he could work with the West. There was a brief window when the world could have taken a different path. That window closed because of fear, misunderstanding, and the tragic inability of two very different cultures to trust each other. The Americans, with their faith in democracy and free markets, couldn't understand why the Soviets needed buffer states and tight control. The Soviets, scarred by centuries of invasion and revolution, couldn't understand why the Americans wanted to surround them with bases and allies. The nuclear arms race that followed was the most dangerous competition in human history. By 1986, the United States and Soviet Union had accumulated 70,000 nuclear weapons, enough to destroy human civilization dozens of times over. Children grew up practicing Deccan-covered drills. Families built fallout shelters. The world lived under the constant threat of accidental apocalypse. Yet through it all, there were moments of hope. Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy, despite nearly triggering World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis, developed a grudging respect for each other. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev discovered they could actually like each other during their summit meetings in the 1980s. The Cold War finally ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Soviet economy, bankrupted by military spending and inefficient planning, simply collapsed. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The rivalry that had defined the second half of the 20th century was over. Or was it? Today, as I record this, tensions between Russia and America are at their highest level since the 1980s. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who came of age during the Cold War, clearly believes that Russia is still locked in an existential struggle with the West. American politicians routinely describe Russia as America's greatest threat. The weapons have changed. Instead of nuclear missiles, we now worry about cyber attacks, election interference, and disinformation campaigns. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Two great powers who view each other's strengths as an existential threat to their own security. What can we learn from this history? First, that fear is contagious. When one side arms itself for defense, the other side sees offense. When one side builds alliances for security, the other side sees encirclement. Both America and Russia fell into this trap in the 1940s, and they're falling into it again today. Second, that cultural misunderstanding can be as dangerous as military weapons. Americans valued individual freedom and saw Soviet control as oppression. Soviets valued collective security and saw American freedom as chaos. Neither side could truly understand the other's perspective, because they were looking through completely different cultural lenses. Finally, that the price of great power rivalry is paid not by the leaders who make these decisions, but by ordinary people who live with the consequences. The Cold War cost trillions of dollars that could have been spent on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. It proxy wars that killed millions in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other countries. But here's the most important lesson. It doesn't have to be this way. The Cold War wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people at specific moments. Different choices could have led to a different world. Think about it. What if Roosevelt had lived to manage the post-war relationship with Stalin? What if Truman had been more patient with Soviet security concerns? What if Stalin had been more transparent about his intentions in Eastern Europe? What if both sides had recognized that their former ally was acting out of fear, not aggression? We'll never know what might have been, but we can learn from what was. The next time you hear politicians talking about inevitable conflicts between great powers, remember the story of how America and Russia went from the closest allies to the most dangerous enemies in human history. Remember that this rivalry was born not from hatred, but from fear. And fear, unlike hatred, can be overcome. The challenge for our generation is to break the cycle, to find ways for great powers to compete without threatening each other's existence, to remember that the people on the other side of any rivalry are human beings with families, dreams, and fears just like us. The war that made Russia America's silent rival taught us that even the strongest friendships can become the most bitter enemies when fear overwhelms trust. But it also taught us something more hopeful, that even the most dangerous rivalries can end when leaders choose cooperation over competition, understanding over suspicion, and hope over fear. The question now is, what will we choose? Will we repeat the mistakes of the past, or will we finally learn from them? The answer may determine whether our children inherit a world of fear or a world of hope. The story of America and Russia is far from over, But unlike the leaders of 1945, we know how this kind of rivalry ends. We've seen the price of mutual fear and the power of mutual trust. We have the wisdom that comes from historical perspective. What we do with that wisdom will write the next chapter of this ongoing story. And unlike the last chapter, we still have the power to choose how this one ends. What do you think? Could the Cold War have been avoided if leaders had made different choices? How can today's superpowers avoid repeating the same mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives help shape future content. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden history behind today's headlines, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We dig deep into the untold stories that shaped our world, revealing the human drama behind the history books. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode that could change how you see the world. Remember, history doesn't just happen to us, we make it with every choice we make. Understanding the past is the first step to creating a better future. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.